Alright guys, welcome. So I'm going to talk today about electric cars in general, a little bit about the Bolt specifically, but what we really need to do is learn more like of a foundation of what's going on with electric cars right now. Just to give you a little bit of a background, first of all, I'm going to ask a question. Survey the massive audience that we have here. Does anybody know when the first electric car came out? The very first one.
1905.
Andy says 1905.
1912.
Okay. Davey?
No idea.
No idea. Are you surprised that these guys were saying 1912 and 1905? Does that surprise you?
I heard electric cars were out back then.
Yeah.
Before they stopped.
All right, cool. So I'm not really divulging any, any like crazy information here. You guys already seem to know that electric cars have actually been around for quite a long time. The first one came out in 1890. Okay, electric cars and gas cars kind of came out around the same time. If you think about it, people were riding horse-drawn carriages and trying to come up with ideas of how to power them without having a horse, right? So there were lots of options. Electricity was probably the most, prevalent option at the time too. So electric cars have been around for a long time. They quickly realized that back then the technology only allowed you to go a certain distance. It was pretty short, a certain speed. It was like 23 kilometers an hour. So I could literally ride my bike faster than an electric car from 1890. But the technology was already starting. They were thinking about it. So the technology is not new. The underlying foundation of it, that's something to keep in mind. Because a lot of people now, they're saying, oh, electric cars, new technology, oh, it's, the cutting edge and all this. And yeah, the technology that's going into modern electric cars is cutting edge, and it's pretty remarkable how far they've come. But the actual idea of having an electric car has been around for a really long time. So to understand electric cars, you need to understand electricity. Okay? So, gone are the days of miles per gallon, unfortunately horsepower, although you can measure horsepower in an electric car, and all the other things that are associated with gas-powered cars. When we're talking about electric cars, we're talking about electricity. These terms that I've written down here on this board, at least the top 6 of them, are not unique to electric cars. This is just general terminology. If you're an electrician, you know what that is. You know what that is. You know what all these 6 things stand for if you know electricity. So since we're selling electric cars, we need to understand electricity. We've already had a quick chat about this, I think, a couple days ago. You guys know the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour, right? We've already talked about that. A kilowatt is a unit of power. So this would be equivalent to like a horsepower or torque. Okay? It's a unit of power. In fact, you can go on Google and you can Google how many horsepower are in a kilowatt, or vice versa, and you can get that exact translation, okay? Because a kilowatt can be converted into a horsepower, because they're both units of power. Now, here's where things get a little different. With electric cars, we also have a term called kilowatt hour, right? Now, with gas cars, we don't have anything called horsepower hour or anything like that. You have gallons and liters, and that's a unit of measurement of storage of space, right? This is also a unit of storage or a unit of capacity, okay? But with electric cars, if anything, it actually makes a little bit more sense. If you think about it, you're not going to fill your truck up with 200 horsepowers, right? 200 horsepower hours or whatever. But you can fill your electric car up with, in this case here, this car, we can fill it up with 66 kilowatt hours of electricity, right? That's how much electricity the battery in this car will hold. So it's a unit of its capacity or storage. Okay, so carrying on from there, if you've got I'm going to use really round numbers, and we'll talk about Tesla because they happen to use nice round numbers. They have a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack in a Tesla. Interestingly enough, the new Ultium GM batteries that we're going to see later on this year in the Lyriq and in some other cars, they also come in 100 kilowatt hour size. So that'll make it really nice and easy for math, because I'm not that great at math. But a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack will hold 100 kilowatts of power, enough capacity to give you 100 kilowatts of power for 1 hour, right? Or 50 kilowatts of power for 2 hours, or 10 kilowatts of power for 10 hours. Make sense? It's pretty easy math, right? And so what's a kilowatt? Well, a kilowatt is 1,000 watts, right? So if you have a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack, and you could run, obviously, 10 kilowatts for 10 hours, that's 10,000 watts, right? You see where I'm going? So that's like 10,000 watts of power. Well, that's a lot. 10,000 watts is like 10 microwaves. A typical microwave is around 1,000 watts, maybe 1,500 watts. But let's say a small microwave is 1,000 watts. That means your electric car can run 10 microwaves for 10 hours. Right? Pretty cool. You can't figure any of that kind of stuff out with a gas car, can you? There's no way. Say gallons, miles per gallon, liters per 100 kilometers, all that stuff. It actually makes things easier, believe it or not, with electric cars. You got a question?
Is that about 10 microwaves for 1 hour or 1 microwave?
So 10 microwaves that are 1,000 watts is 10,000 watts, right? 10,000 watts is 10 kilowatts. And we're talking about a Tesla here with a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack. So that 100 kilowatt hour battery pack could power 10 microwaves, right? Because that's 10,000 watts for 10 hours, because that's 100 kilowatt hours. Make sense? Anyways, feel free to ask questions. I've got some basic guides here, so I'm going to kind of keep things moving as much as I can. But I also want your guys' input. This isn't really as much fun or as interesting for anyone unless we get some questions. So yeah, I encourage you to ask questions if you have some. Okay. So everyone's with me so far? Unit of power, unit of capacity. So get back to this. A kilowatt, you could be measuring two different things in kilowatts, remember. So one is energy that you're delivering to the car, right, through a charger. You're giving the car a certain amount of power in kilowatts, or you're consuming a certain amount of power in kilowatts, like I said with the microwave example. More pertinent to the electric car is the actual motor itself in the electric car. Typical motor is going to be around like 200 kilowatts. So at full, if you really stomp on it. Keep in mind, motor can draw almost an infinite amount of power up to its maximum, right? Because when we say your truck has 400 horsepower, 420. When your truck has 420 horsepower, that's just its maximum capacity, right, Kirby? It doesn't mean it has 420 horsepower at 2,000 RPM. It just means if you put your foot down and rev it all the way up to 6,200 RPM or whatever it is, you get up to 420 horsepower. An electric motor is kind of the same in some ways. Like it can produce that much power if you really plant your foot down. Okay. So if you have a 200 kilowatt motor and you just drove with your foot down straight for half an hour, that's how long it would take to deplete your 100 kilowatt hour battery pack. Make sense? Right? So the motor itself is measured in kilowatts. Like I said, the microwave, the heating and air conditioning system in the car is measured in kilowatts as well. Okay, anything that consumes electricity is going to consume a certain amount of power, right? And that battery can provide that amount of power for a certain period of time. And that's where we get the hours, okay? Same thing with charging. So this is where this comes in really handy when you're trying to figure out how long it takes to charge an electric car, or how long it takes to charge the battery, more specifically. So, do you have a question? All right. So if you've got a charger that can provide you with 50 kilowatts, right? 50 kilowatts of power, well, 100 kilowatt hour battery, using really, really simple math, you'd assume it would take you 2 hours to charge that battery. Now that doesn't get into, there's a lot of other things that factor into how long it takes to charge a battery. We'll get into that later. But the basics of it are, okay, I've got a charger here that gives me 50 kilowatts. I've got a 100 kilowatt hour battery. Great, I can measure the amount of energy that I'm sending to the car, and I can also measure the amount of energy that the car is using. And of course, right there in the middle, I can measure the amount of energy that that car stores on board in the battery, right? So there's kind of 3 things going on. Energy coming in, energy being stored, and energy going out. Okay, so we're all good there? I know this is kind of like, I want to lay like a good foundation so people understand exactly what's going on. And the idea is, I think a lot of consumers coming into the store, some of them may know this, and if they do, that's great. You're going to be knowledgeable, and I'm sure they'll be impressed when you start having a conversation with them about it. But a lot of consumers won't. Probably most of them won't have any idea. Someone might come in and say, "Oh, that car's got a 60 kilowatt battery." It's like, well, hey, let me tell you a little bit about how that works, right? Like, a kilowatt is actually how much power the car uses, right? The battery itself is actually 60 kilowatt hours, right? And if you have a good understanding of it, it's not like I want you guys to give a physics lesson to every customer that comes in. But if you know it, if you understand it, then you'll be able to talk about it with that much more confidence, right? Okay. What does this mean? Volt. Yeah, volt. You guys know what a volt is? Not car. Just no. You know what different volts are? Like there's 120 volts, whatever, 110 actually, what it actually is, but 120, 240 volts. Like you've heard of different voltages, right? That's pretty commonly known. And a volt is like, think of it as, so what I'm going to get to is actually how we come up with this number, or this measure of power is the kilowatt. A volt is like if you imagine a garden hose. This is how it was explained to me when I was in physics. And I wasn't paying a lot of attention in physics, but this is what I do recollect. So I could be proven to be wrong potentially, but the best analogy is a garden hose. Okay? So a garden hose. I get customers calling me all the time. A garden hose has a certain size, right, and a certain flow. Okay, think of it this way: the bigger the diameter of that garden hose, the more water you can fit through it, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you are putting more water through it, because the other side of it is how much, like the flow of water is, right? So you can have a big garden hose, but the tap's not turned on it's not that far open, and you're just kind of dribbling a bit of water out. Okay, so bear with me here. So if the diameter of the hose is the volts, like how much, like 240 volts is a lot of power, or a lot of voltage, I guess you'd call it. The amps, A, is the flow of that power, okay? So there's 2 things going on here. We all know volts are typically in your typical house, and most, basically any power that's connected to the power grid is going to be mostly 120 volts, okay? But when it comes to electric cars and charging electric cars in particular, for the most part we're doing it actually at 240 volts. So we've got, and in electric car terms, we call this level 1 charging for 120, and level 2 charging. Hmm?
24 volts.
Yeah, 240 volts. All right. There's also level 3 charging, but we'll get into that when we get down here. So let's start off here, level 1 charging. So we're going to move over this way. This is our lovely level 1 charger. I'm going to write over here. Jack's going to just love this. Level 1. Look at that. So that's our level 1 charger. Guess what? I don't know too many people that don't have a level 1 charger for their electric car. How many people have a gas pump attached to their house? No. Not that many. Maybe somebody does. I don't know. But everybody's got a level 1 electric car charger in their house somewhere. Now, admittedly, some are probably going to be more convenient than others. Right? If you're living in an apartment on the 30th floor and you don't have a parking spot, well, you're probably not going to be running an extension cord down from the 30th floor. But if you happen to be living in a house or a townhouse or somewhere where there's a plug nearby where you park your car, you can do exactly what we're doing right here. You take your level 1 regular plug, it looks just like that, plug it into the wall, you're getting 120 volts, and then you take the other end of this plug and you plug it into your car. Simple, right? So that's the easiest way to get electricity into your car. It's also the slowest way to get electricity into your car. And that's, we're going to go back and board here, what we're going to calculate here right now. So that wall plug, we already know it's 120 volts, right? I can also tell you, it's on a 15 amp circuit. Now, you don't really need to get into too many details about this, but I will tell you, if you go into any modern house with an electrical panel with circuit breakers, most of the circuit breakers are 15 amp circuit breakers, okay? And they'll control a circuit with a bunch of different things on it. Typically, either it'll have all the plugs in your garage, or it'll have the fridge, or the lights, or it'll have, the heaters. Now, there are some things that work off of higher amperages that need more than 15 amps, so those are separate usually. But most plugs that you're going to be plugging your car into are connected to a circuit breaker in the electrical panel that runs off of a 15 amp breaker. So basically what that means is it'll draw 15 amps, that's the flow of power, right, at 120 volts. And if it goes over 15 amps, then it flips the breaker and all your power gets shut off. So you want to keep anything that you plugged into that plug, you want to keep it well below 15 amps. 15 is the limit. Okay? So that's why when you get into a Bolt and some other electric cars, but most don't actually give you the option, like the Bolt does, of when you're plugged into a level 1 charger, just level 1, it gives you the option of either going 8 amps or 12 amps. Okay? There's an option in that screen where you can flip it back and forth. Now the reason you would do that, obviously at 12 amps it'll charge a little bit faster, but it'll also be getting pretty close to the limit of that breaker, a typical breaker in a typical house. So if you happen to have a fridge, like a little bar fridge in your garage here, and you've got your car turned on 12 amps, and then the fridge kicks in, well, it might blow the breaker. It's not a big deal. The breaker just flips over and you just reset the switch. No harm, no foul, but you've obviously exceeded the capacity of that breaker. So in that case, you go in your car, you flip it down to 8 amps, and then you'd probably be okay. All right? So that gives you the option. So we know, based on that our car, the Bolt, charges at either 8 amps, okay, or 12 amps. On a 120 volt level 1 plug. Let's do a little math here. Because this is how we find out the kilowatts. This is a really cool thing about electricity. All this stuff, one thing always affects the other. Okay? If I have a 120 volt plug, and I'm running, let's go with 12 amps, okay? That's the wattage that I'm getting, right? All I did is I went 120 times 12, so 1440 So that plug there, if I've got it plugged into the wall and I get the other end plugged into the car and I turn the switch to 12, right? I'm getting 1440 watts.
Per hour. Is that?
No, if you plug it in for an hour, then you get 1440 watts per hour, correct? But if you just turn it on, plug it in, that's the number of watts, right? Remember back to the microwave, I said, like a 1500 watt microwave or a 1000 watt microwave, obviously would be pretty close to maxing out one of those breakers, right? But the car pulls 1440 watts, right? Well, remember what a kilowatt is. Everybody know what a kilowatt is, right? Exactly. A kilo, a kilo is 1,000. So 1440 watts is 1.4 kilowatts, right? So if I plug this car in with that setup for 1 hour, how much did I just charge up the battery by?
1,1.4 kilowatts.
I've added how much capacity, right? How much storage capacity have I added? Or how much electricity have I added to the battery? 1.4 kilowatt hours, right? Kind of makes sense. But that took 1 hour, and I added 1.4. All right, well, this car here has a 66 kilowatt hour battery pack divided by 1.4. That's how long it's going to take me to completely charge the car. This is why 47.1 hours. Holy shit. Thank you for that, Andy. Anyways, that's why we're talking level 1 here, right? Again, it's the easiest way to charge your car. You can plug it in anywhere, no worries. As long as there's not a bunch of other crap plugged into the circuit, you're good. You can draw up to 12 amps at 120 volts, and it'll take you 50 hours to charge your car. Okay? This is the reason why it's not a super practical solution. However, I will say, for customers that aren't doing a whole lot of driving throughout the course of a day, think about this. In 10 hours, overnight, say I plugged my car into a level 1 charger overnight, and I left it there for 10 hours, right? I would get 11.4 kilowatt hours of electricity, right? Well, if I'm driving a Bolt, 11.4 kilowatt hours will get me 70-ish kilometers of range, 70 to 80 kilometers of range pretty easily. So if I'm only driving 70 or 80 kilometers a day, I can easily replenish that back into my battery at night, right? So for those customers, if they're driving less than 100 kilometers a day, which is actually probably most people, yeah, actually a level 1, just a regular plug. I know it sounds crazy to say it's going to take you 50 hours to charge up your car, but keep in mind, that's from 0, if your battery's completely dead, all the way up to 100%. Which, again, we're going to get into more of this later, but that's not something that's practical. It's not something that most people do. Most people don't charge their battery to 100%. Most people don't bring it all the way to 0, right? It's usually somewhere in the middle. But if you drive 100 kilometers in one day, all it will take is plugging it in for like 12 or so hours, and you get all that range back at night. So yeah, some people do use level 1. It's obviously best to use a level 1 charger where you can go with the 12 amps, because of course it's going to take even longer at 8 amps, right? But this is a somewhat practical solution for some people, okay? Once we step it up to level 2, now we've got a situation that is super practical for everything. Literally, I can't think of someone who would not be able to make use of a level 2 charger in a longer range electric car like the Bolt or Tesla or any other long range electric car if they have the level 2 charger set up at home, because level 2, it changes the whole game, okay? You can do some math here. Again, when you step up to a level 2 charger like this, or like that one over on the wall, these guys run on their own breaker, okay? So if we go, let's go over to this one here. So remember we were talking about those plugs that might have a fridge plugged in them or some lights or whatever. Well, as soon as you step up to a level 2 charger, 240 volts comes out of this plug, And it's always connected, it's got a dedicated breaker, okay? So you're always getting the maximum amount of amperage, or potentially getting that maximum amount of amperage. From here, you're not going to have to worry about anything else plugged into any circuit, because this is its own circuit, okay? This guy here runs on a 40 amp circuit, okay? They come in all different sizes. You could get a level 2 charger as low as 16 amps, or as high as 100 amps. And really, that is just, all that means is that's how much power you can pull from this plug. That's the maximum that you can pull from this plug. It doesn't mean your car is going to charge at 100 amps, because in the case of the Volt, for example, you can't. It's not possible. But it could, this system could provide you up to that amount, right? So this is where each electric car is a little different, and each one of these is a little different. So this is where you have to start getting into some gray area. However, I will say, back to the math here, the majority of level 2 chargers are on a 40 amp circuit, okay? That's a 40 amp circuit. Most people installing one in their home, they'll have a 40 amp breaker that provides power to their level 2 charger. Okay, so let's go with that. But just remember, it can be higher, it can be lower. Okay, but we're just kind of using a generalization. So these are 40 amps. Well, you guys already know the math. First of all, I'm going to do one quick thing. If it's on a 40 amp breaker, just like remember these guys were actually on a 15 amp breaker before you do that math. The 12 amps that I was talking about earlier on the 120 volts, that's actually on a 15 amp breaker. So the same thing here, when you have a 40 amp breaker, you're not actually going to be getting 40 amps. Okay? These chargers are rated, if it's on a 40 amp breaker, it's rated for about 32 amps. Okay? So keep in mind, you're never maxing it out. You never want to be, because that's actually where the breaker trips. So forget about 40, we're going to call it 32. And that's pretty typical for an electric car charger. So you've done the math there, you can do it again with 32 amps. 7.68 kilowatts, right? So 7,600 watts. So that's a lot more than 1,400, isn't it? Like way more. And that's kind of an average. Keep in mind, the Volt, the new style Volt, like what we have right here, that was 7,600 kilowatts. This guy, the charger that's built into the car can go up to 11 kilowatts, right? So almost double of that, what that, so it could potentially charge that plug can provide.
You're right, 14, 40, and 76.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So I'm going to go 120 at, that's volts, at 12 amps is 1440 kilowatts, right? And that's right there. And if we have 240 volts at 32 amps, Iggy, what was that again?
7,680.
7680. Cool. All right. Now, so 1440, 7680. This guy will go up to 11,000. So that's, keep in mind, these numbers are, that's based on the charger in the car. So level 2 charging, this is something else that not a lot of people realize. The charger that charges up your battery, when you're plugged into any of these situations that we're talking about right now, the charger's actually in the car. How many people realize that? So when you're plugging this isn't the charger.